You may remember that Cyberpunk 2077 released in what we'll call a not very good state, as in its release was pretty much a disaster, and I was actually one of the relatively lucky people that was able to play it on launch, and had a relatively smooth experience, but it was still full of a lot of visual glitching, a couple of progress stopping bugs where I had to reload the game and actually redo an entire quest just to progress, and some other stuff like that, and that was actually being lucky, because the game was just in such an unfinished, buggy, horrible state that there were actually a lot of people that, the less lucky ones, that basically couldn't play it at all. It ran terribly, it crashed all the time, it was just a big mess. And I said in my video at the time that we knew that there were some patches that were going to be coming out in the coming months because they basically knew, how buggy it was, and they announced that they were in fact going to be supporting it and working on it for a while, in the same way that they did something like The Witcher 3, which was also quite buggy on release, although not to the degree that Cyberpunk was, and it did take quite a few patches before it was in more of a presentable state. And I figured I really should be doing my due diligence that I mentioned in the end of that video and actually go back and look at it, because I didn't feel comfortable just sort of leaving that video as it is when I know the game has been patched a lot. I should actually, put forth the effort, go back to it now that it's had several years of patches, and actually see how it is. And in this case, I'm playing the version 1.52. There is actually another patch, the version 1.6 patch, that is on the way at the time of recording this video, but it is not quite out yet. So how is the game now? How has it changed? What's been added? What's been shored up? And is it actually something that I would recommend people buy at this point? And just as a quick sort of too long didn't watch at the very beginning of this video, yeah, they actually have fixed up a lot of aspects of this game. It is in a much, much better state than it was when it launched. It is far more stable, it has a ton of bug fixes, and has a lot of extra content as well. So it is now in a place where I am actually comfortable with saying, if you're interested in it, I can actually recommend that you buy it, because it'll actually work for you. But it is still the same Cyberpunk. Basically, it's kind of like No Man's Sky in terms of how it's been patched and things. If your problem with No Man's Sky was that it was buggy, unfinished, feeling very content sparse, then the patches that have come out since the game's release will probably make you like it. But if your problem with the game was that it was a procedurally focused survival game in space, then, well, it's still the same No Man's Sky, right? So the patches, although they've made it a lot more stable and a lot more interesting, it's still the same game at its foundation, so you probably still won't like it. And Cyberpunk is in the exact same boat. It is a game that has had a lot of fixes and a lot of shoring up done to it to make it run, look, and just perform in general better than it ever did. So if your problem with the game was that it was unfinished or that it ran badly or one of those things, then it's in a much better state now. But if your problem with the game was that you were expecting more of like a Grand Theft Auto or a Deus Ex style game and you got something that was more akin to like a looter shooter basically, then, well, it's still the same Cyberpunk, so, you probably still won't like it. It is a very flawed game in its way, but we'll get onto that in a little while. So what all has changed, what's been added in these couple years of updates? Well, first of all, of course, are the innumerable numbers of bug fixes that have occurred, because there were lots of bugs to fix, and I seem to recall several mission-critical bugs at launch, including one that caused all doors in a building to lock permanently, and you couldn't hack them or force them open in any way, and it actually broke all of the AI pathfinding and required you to reload a save in order to try and fix it. Stuff like that, a lot of the mission-critical bugs have actually been squashed pretty early, and the more recent patches have focused on the smaller bugs. I seem to recall that in pretty much every single cutscene on launch, there was some sort of minor visual glitch happening in the background almost at all times, from textures that wouldn't load, to T-posing characters just sort of floating around in the background menacing you, to facial animation just completely breaking and not even trying, to certain lines that would just go silent for some reason. The facial animation would work, but the line wouldn't actually play, so like the rest of the cutscene would play out in silence. All sorts of just little things like that that added up to making the whole experience feel very buggy and unstable. And those have luckily been pretty much solved in all but a few, because rather than how it was on launch, where I had just about every single cutscene something like this going wrong, now in my new playthrough I've only had one of these problems occur in one cutscene for just like a couple of frames that then fixed itself right afterwards. So overall, the bug fixing has added a lot to the game, because, these bugs, most of them weren't progression stopping. They didn't like ruin the game and break it or anything, but there were so many of them that were appearing so frequently that it added this air of instability and unfinishedness to the game that made it just feel really kind of slapped together. So just fixing these bugs and making a lot of these visual glitches and stuff go away has made the experience feel a lot smoother. Another one of the most common complaints of the game at launch was its AI. It had a lot of breakages and really weird behaviors, and of course some of it just felt completely unfinished or even unimplemented, and that has also been shored up a lot in the more recent patches, with the things like the companion AI not breaking so easily anymore, to where like their pathfinding just quits even trying, and they do all sorts of weird stuff like jumping in place, and that sort of stuff has pretty much stopped. The enemy AI is a lot better as well, because they'll actually work harder to hack you, flush you out with grenades, things like that, the way they should have been acting in the first place. It makes the combat a little bit more challenging, although still not extremely hard. It just goes to show you how it should have actually been when it launched. The traffic AI has actually been improved as well, and the police AI, which is one of the big points of contention at release, has been implemented, because it seemed like there basically was none at first. And so yeah, things like the traffic AI is a little bit more dynamic now, it feels a little bit less brain dead, and the police AI will actually respond to things like acts of violence in front of them and stuff like that, where they should actually be paying attention. All that stuff actually works now, and it makes the overall AI aspect of the game feel more finished than it was when it released. There have also been a number of features added, quite a few of them actually, things that people were requesting be in the game at launch that have actually been implemented. So you've got all sorts of things, from of course the more obvious, like just more stuff, more weapons and more hacks and more consumables and just, you know, more weapon and item variety in general that has been added, but there's also a lot of other smaller features and things, like for instance the ability to customize your apartment, the ability to actually buy entirely new apartments in other areas. There are even some announced features and things like the 1.6 update involving stuff like transmogs, so you can actually alter the way you look with a lot more detail and stuff than before. There's something that definitely should have been added in the very beginning of the game, which was the ability to change your character's appearance after character creation. So now you can just go to a mirror and actually change how you look whenever you want. So yeah, there have been quite a few features that either should have been in the game at launch, or that were just stuff that could have been added to make the experience more interesting, that have been added in the last several updates. There have also been several features that have been tweaked in different ways. For instance, all of the car handling has been completely redone, it seems, so that vehicles now handle in a much better way than they did before. You have little details like the minimap zooming out in a vehicle so that you can actually tell where you're going at high speed, that sort of thing. You've also got a complete rebalance of how damage and weapon systems work, so there's actually been like a full-on rehauling of the balance of the game in several ways, and the last several updates, especially like 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5, there have been some pretty significant changes to the overall balance of everything, and in my opinion it's been for the better. Weapons, just combat in general now feels more lethal. It feels like you do more damage and enemies are less bullet spongy, but it also feels that enemies do more damage and you have to look out for them a little bit more, which is the kind of balancing that I like. I think it makes sense. I like the idea of making combat more fast-paced and lethal, especially in a game like this. It just makes it feel better, in my opinion, and the balance hasn't stopped there. There's also been some balance changes to pretty much all of the perk trees. So now there are other things that are more viable than they used to be, and some things like hacking have been nerfed a little bit because they were extremely powerful. And in my opinion, they're still in a good place. This game has some of the best combat hacking I've ever seen in a video game, and I really like the hacking tree, but even I have to admit that it was drastically overpowered in the base game when it first launched. And I don't mind things being overpowered in a single-player game. I think it's fun to work towards a goal that makes you super strong, but I think that hacking was too strong in the sense that it barely took any investment to become a god of death, basically. By like level 10 or 12, you could make it to where you could kill entire buildings without ever having to even step into them. And I don't mind hacking being that strong, because it's really fun, but it's now harder to just completely break the hacking system because the balance has shifted a little bit and made it less immediately powerful. They've also added quite a bit to the visuals of the game, including entire like next-gen texture update stuff and RTX support, so you've actually got several new ray tracing options and things that look quite nice with the lighting and shadows of the game, so that's a nice addition. Obviously it's entirely optional, and there's good DLSS support now as well, so it's good to have a lot more visual customization than you had originally with a lot better detail, and also the game just runs better. Not only does it look better, but it actually just works better, you know, because when Cyberpunk first launched, it had a lot of really weird performance issues, with certain areas being oddly huge on performance despite not having a lot going on. You know, you would expect like downtown Night City with all the lights and people and cars and stuff to sort of hit your frame rate a bit, but there were some places in areas like the Badlands with like literally nothing going on at all that were also really heavy on performance hits for no reason at all. And that kind of thing has been shored up a lot. The performance is a lot more stable now, and it just works better. Even being in like very heated combat with a lot of NPCs and a lot of effects and explosions and hacking and stuff going off, the performance is a lot more stable and a lot more consistent now, and I've been able to run it at very high frame rates and actually keep it at those frame rates instead of having all sorts of weird dips here and there, especially in things like intense combat or driving really fast or some of the other things that at launch caused some weird performance hits. That stuff doesn't happen anymore. It's just way more stable of an experience. I've also not had it crash in the time that I've been playing this newest playthrough, whereas I definitely did have several crashes at launch. They've also improved the crowd and traffic variety. As you're driving around, you'll see, or just walking around honestly, you'll see a lot more variety in vehicles and especially in NPC models, making the overall crowds feel more lively and less copy-paste. There is also a couple of sliders in the options menu to determine the density and variety of the crowds, so that if it's something that's affecting your performance a lot, you can actually lower it if you wish, but if you have the right specs, you can crank it up and have really nice, lively crowds that are way better than they were when the game launched. So overall, it's in a much better, more stable, more finished feeling state than it's ever been, and I can actually happily recommend that people play it now if they were at all interested in it before. However, after saying all this, there are still some aspects of the game that feel like some missed opportunities. It is still a very flawed game at its core. You know, being more of a looter shooter is not what people expected and is not what a lot of people wanted. For instance, I don't really mind myself, but even I have to admit that it's something that I didn't necessarily expect, and a lot of people were hoping for more of like a Deus Ex feeling situation than what we actually ended up getting. There's also the fact that things like the cybernetic augmentations just don't go far enough. I feel that they're kind of a big missed opportunity. I wish you could do a lot more with them than you actually can. You know, replacing an entire arm with a minigun, or putting blades in your legs, or doing all sorts of silly stuff like that, and having to deal with like potential cyberpsychosis because of how much you're augmenting yourself, and just overall replacing all sorts of bits of yourself, because that's what Cyberpunk is about, right? It's about transhumanism. And the fact that you can't really go too crazy on the augmentations has always been kind of a shame to me, because I feel, like I said, that it's a bit of a missed opportunity, really a big one, when it comes to a game that is this open with its build variety, and yet doesn't really allow you to go too crazy on the augmentations. It's also a game where the open world just doesn't really serve it extremely well, which is weird because CD Projekt Red, right, they made, in my opinion, one of the best open worlds in a video game at the time of its release in the form of The Witcher 3, which was an absolutely amazing open world with tons of stuff to do, just really densely packed with interesting things to see that didn't feel like copy-pasted content and didn't feel like going down a checklist. It was all really fun to explore. You could just go to a settlement, pick a random direction, and walk, and you would find really cool stuff. And Night City feels like a definite step back in that regard, because although there is stuff to do and there's fun stuff to find and see, it's actually pretty fun and easy to get lost in Night City and just get immersed and enjoy the sights. It's also very focused on settlements, and outside of the major settlements with lots of stuff to do, there's really not a lot. You know, the big settlement areas have a good amount of quests and content to see, but all of the rest of the map in between all the big settlements is relatively barren and just doesn't feel as lively and interesting as its contemporaries. If you look at something like Grand Theft Auto 5 or something like Red Dead Redemption 2, you know, your Rockstar open worlds, or even The Witcher 3, since it's their previous game, you see open worlds that are densely packed with really interesting random encounters and all sorts of cool stuff to find, and Night City just doesn't have that, in my opinion. It's got neat stuff here and there, it's got really good attention to detail in certain areas, but outside of those areas, it's relatively content sparse, and that's kind of a shame. So overall, yeah, they actually have fixed Cyberpunk, and they continue to add to it, and the 1.6 update is promising some really cool new features as well, so they're obviously continuing to work on this game in general, and I like the state that it's in now, and like I said, I can actually safely recommend to people to buy it if they've been interested in it. I couldn't do that when it launched, because I was recommending something that might not even work for you, you know? I'm not comfortable with recommending people spend $60 on something that might not even function at all. That's just not my job, that's not what I do. I am a pro-consumer advocate, you know, I try to do right by the customers, and in this case, recommending that people buy Cyberpunk on launch was definitely not doing right by them. But in this case, now I actually feel that it's in such a good state that, yeah, I can safely say if you have held back on Cyberpunk, or if you bought it on launch but haven't played it since then because of the state that it was in, it is now in a significantly better place. You can just slap on some mods for some extra quality of life stuff and have a really good time. It's a fun game, but it's also going to go down in history as a very flawed game that has a lot of missed opportunities in it. And I'm really curious as to what this game is going to mean for CD Projekt Red in the future, because they were riding high on the wave of PC gaming supremacy after the launch of The Witcher 3, and everyone felt that they could do no wrong, and then reality hit like a big wave crashing down when Cyberpunk released and showed that they were just like any other games company with a lot of mismanagement and crunch and all sorts of very unpleasant things, and they were not these perfect little angels that could do no wrong. So now I have to wonder, what's their next game going to be like? What are they going to do next? What are they going to pivot to? And how is it all going to work when they don't have that trademark fan base, that goodwill that they accrued because they burned it all on the relatively disastrous release of this game? And although they've most certainly patched up their reputation a bit with the various updates to this game, it is still never going to recover to the state that it was in before Cyberpunk launched. So I'm interested to see what comes in the future, both for this game and for the teams in general over at CD Projekt. So that is my current look at Cyberpunk and its updated state. It's really shored up quite a lot. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.